Okay, so I'm with the Free Market Foundation. We've been operating in South Africa for 50 years. We are passionate about advancing the cause of freedom in South Africa. And that finds expression in different ways. We do a lot of research, a lot of advocacy, a lot of engagement in the media at events like this to spread the message of the importance of individual liberty. And what does that really mean? What are the ingredients of a free society of flourishing individuals? It's one where you have economic freedom, so you are able to freely trade and transact and engage in commerce with one another. Hence the name on the tin, the Free Market Foundation. That needs to be operating under the system of the rule of law, of clear and transparent and equally applied laws that are applied to all citizens regardless of their power or status. Private property rights is one of the intrinsic rights that all individuals have. That's the expression of your natural right of ownership. And when we talk about all of these ingredients, one of the other principles obviously is constitutionalism, limited government. So we want to keep government small, we want to constrain its power, because unconstrained power can lead to very damaging consequences and can also infringe very dramatically and negatively on people's lives, on their ability to be self-actualized agents and to enjoy those freedoms that I've outlined. So when we think about those principles, I think sound money is really one of the foundational principles of economic freedom. So myself and my colleagues have been busy with the Liberty First series of policy papers. We've been writing papers on all of those themes that I mentioned, on deregulation, on freedom to trade internationally, on constitutionalism and private property rights. But I was tasked with writing this paper on sound money, and it's called State-Proof Money, the case for Bitcoin adoption in South Africa. So I want to go through this principle of state-proofing and why it is that you should state-proof yourself. So when we think about this idea of state-proofing, and we think about the relationship that South Africans have to the state and the particular context and circumstances of government in South Africa, I think we have an unusual paradox here in South Africa, which is that the state is very big, it's very expansive, and it's taking on more and more functions, and it interferes in the daily lives of individuals, of firms. We heard earlier from some of the speakers about the extensive regulatory requirements that are imposed on the economy. And at the same time, and my view is that a lot of those regulations are not just the product of inefficiency, they're actually often hostile policies, and they are inimical to the principles that I outlined earlier. So if you think of a policy proposal like expropriation without compensation, that is a direct affront to the principle of private property rights, of your right of ownership, that the state can be empowered to seize your property against your will, use its coercive power to take control of what is rightfully your asset. Black economic empowerment, our institution has been very critical of it as a policy that distorts free exchange, that goes against the principle of non-racialism and equality before the law. And so when we look broadly at the policy framework, our contention is that policy is fundamentally hostile to freedom in South Africa. And I think freedom is intrinsic to you. It's not necessarily something that you have to ask the government for permission for. There is a contestation that is occurring there based on power dynamics in a society. So the paradox is that the state is at once very powerful and very expansive in its reach, but also the state is failing in its fundamental duties. And we mentioned Anita shared an extract from the blurb for this conference that infrastructure is collapsing, the reticulation of electricity, water, and so on. All of that, we have seen the consequences of state failure all around us. Our transport infrastructure, road, rail, and ports. Those have absorbed significant stress and are breaking down under that stress. So therein lies the paradox. We have this big, expansive state, but also an incapable state. And so how do we, as freedom-loving South Africans, respond to this in a way that preserves life, liberty, and property, which are really those core ingredients? And so when we think about what is the appropriate role for the government, I said that it should be limited, but it really should be about protecting those basic freedoms. Sometimes people want to inflict harm on one another or commit fraud against one another. The state has a very important role to play in adjudicating disputes, in upholding law and order, and maintaining the rule of law. The state is there as a neutral arbitrator to enforce private property rights and to protect the basic security of citizens, their lives. So I think those are really a very constrained vision of the role of the state. So when we think about state-proofing, it's a way of mitigating against the hostility as well as the incapacity of the state. And some of the principles of state-proofing are, in my view, very resonant with Bitcoin. So I'm very enthusiastic about Bitcoin, but I'm not as in the weeds as many of you here today. I'm not a developer, I'm not a Bitcoin entrepreneur, but I think that Bitcoin really holds great promise as a form of sound money, and I'll explain why I think Bitcoin can be used as a tool and as an instrument of state-proofing. So one of the features of South African politics and the political economy more broadly is that we have very extensive tendency towards centralization and control in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats in Pretoria. And that, in my view, is the cause, the upstream cause of a lot of the failures that we see manifesting throughout our society. You have, in many respects, a socialist policy orientation, which is highly redistributive, very critical of private property rights, and sees the state as the leading actor in the economy, pulling all of the levers and determining the allocation of resources and how people should behave in a society. So really the opposite of what a free society should be. And so one of the principles of state-proofing as a corrective to that is to say, well, actually, we want much more decentralization. And as Bitcoiners, you'd be very enthusiastic about the concept of decentralization, but I think it applies much more broadly to the political and constitutional architecture that we have in a diverse, plural society. So in a decentralized system, one of the benefits of that is that it diffuses power down and out. And if you think of a country as vast and complicated as South Africa, basically the size of Western Europe, there's a highly heterogeneous society, many different ethnicities, cultures, languages. There's an urban versus rural divide. And so each of these social localities have their own unique problems and challenges. And my view is that local actors are much better positioned to respond to that complexity and those challenges. And I think since 1910, the formation of the Union of South Africa, the basic underlying premise has always been that Pretoria will decide and that its diktats will emanate out throughout the rest of this unified territory, and that will set the trajectory of the country. And we had, basically since 1948, we've had only two political parties. Well, there's the GNU now, which has changed that dynamic, really operating from the center, first the National Party in 1948, and then the African National Congress in 1994. So decentralization really offers us tools and mechanisms to deal with some of the really complicated challenges that we have at the local level. And we at the Free Market Foundation ran a campaign over the last couple of years called the Campaign for Home Rule, which really tries to advocate for local authorities, business groups, community associations, community policing forums, starting to acquire many more powers for themselves and actually start to wrestle power away from the center. And there are various ways to do that. And in South Africa, our constitutional framework actually enables federalism, but in many respects, the political culture of the country hasn't really embraced that federal ethos. And there's still very much a tendency, in my view, that you need to seek permission in order to act locally. And I think that is a mindset that we need to change. We need to embrace much more of a permissionless model, and one where we understand that the state, particularly the national government, is neither omnipotent nor omnipresent, and that actually there are a lot of gray spaces in between where individuals, businesses, and communities can start to fix the many problems for themselves. If you just think of, for example, a derelict park in your area, there are many groups that have come together voluntarily to clean up and finance and tidy and maintain a public park. That is a public good that benefits the people in that community. But if you wait for somebody from the city council or from the national government to come and fix that problem, you're going to wait for a very long time because of that incapacity. So decentralization is also far more accountable, far more transparent, and really gives you power at an individual level to have more agency and control over these problems. And when we think of how we apply this to money, I think that Bitcoin has many of these state-proof qualities. It's permissionless, it's censorship-resistant, it's immutable. And when we look at institutions of state like the central bank, I think there is a tendency to assume that these institutions are durable, inevitable, well-governed, judiciously led. And, Carl earlier said if you put 3 beers in me, he'll tell you he wants to abolish FICA. But yeah, if you put that many beers in me, I'd say I want to abolish the central bank, the SARB. But it is... But yeah, I can drink as many beers as I like, but the SARB will still remain the next day and I'll have a hangover. But it is an institution that enjoys widespread credibility, and I think South Africans would be right to celebrate the announcement at the medium-term budget policy statement last November that said that South Africa is going to target a lower inflation rate, moving from the 3 to 6% band down to a firm target of 3%. Lower inflation is something to really aspire towards. But we also have to be realistic that in the South African context, many state institutions have been well governed for a time and then been captured. So state capture, we're looking now at the Madlanga Commission. So the entire security apparatus and intelligence networks have been infiltrated allegedly by criminal networks. That is one of those core functions of the state that I mentioned earlier. If some of these allegations prove correct, that's very worrying for the state of justice and law enforcement. SARS has been captured in the past under Tom Moyane. So, and we have legislative proposals from the likes of the economic freedom fighters in terms of amendment legislation, private members' bills that have wanted to end the private ownership of the SARB. That's a fairly anomalous characteristic, but that sends a signal, I believe, that of a impatience with central bank independence. I think if you had to nationalize the SARB, it wouldn't necessarily change its constitutional mandate, but I think it would send a signal that looser monetary policy is a targeted objective of strong political actors. And it's not just the radical EFF. This is a formal policy proposal adopted by the African National Congress at its December 2022 policy conference. They want to respect the constitutional mandate, this resolution suggests, but they want to also move towards looser monetary policy. And why do they want to do that? Because they want to free up spending, They want state spending to be increased. Our patronage-driven politics requires the distribution of resources. And South Africa is borrowing, in terms of its government borrowings, about 370 billion rand a year, which is about 1 billion rand a day, if you calculate it. And so that debt to GDP ratio, at the last medium-term budget, they were saying they want to stabilize that debt. But that's still at about 78% as a proportion of GDP. And global sovereign debt is reaching about 100% debt to GDP ratio. So there is still a great tendency for the state to overtax its citizens, to spend beyond its means, to become mired in excessive debt. And I think that this represents systemic risk to South Africa's economy and to the lives and livelihoods of individuals. And so in the introduction, Jabu Jakes was mentioning that we at the Free Market Foundation are proud adherents of the Austrian School of Economics. And we have a big portrait of Friedrich Hayek, the great Austrian economist, hanging on the wall of our library. And I'd encourage you, if you're ever in Johannesburg, to come visit us at Northwood's house and peruse some of our collection, which Jabu has done. And Hayek's great insight was to say that money is not just a way of exchanging value, it's also a way for information to be disseminated throughout a market and for people to communicate with one another. And his great skepticism of government action, I think, is something that we try to bring. He says that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to man how little he knows about what he imagines he can design. And I think there's great humility in that. And the tendency to centralize and control is a much more hubristic approach that contains great risks and concentrates risk. So Hayek spoke about the importance of denationalizing money. And this was in the 1970s. And he also said maybe we can't seize control of the monetary system by force, but maybe we could find some sly roundabout way of doing so. This was in an interview in the 1980s. So I don't know if he proceeded or had some kind of divine insight into what was to come in January 2009. But I think Bitcoin really has the potential to denationalize money, to wrestle power away from some of these statist institutions and directly enable individuals to take sovereignty over their own financial affairs. So state-proofing it's a strategy, but it's also a mindset. It's about taking responsibility in your immediate environment, in your family, in your community, your neighborhood, in your city, and not waiting for other people to come and solve problems for you. So if we outsource our responsibility to others, particularly politicians who are motivated by short-term incentives in the next election cycle and who are quite happy to spend other people's money, then we're only going to see an amplification of some of these problems. So that's why I think, beyond the technical discussions that we had today, I just want to really encourage you to take the state-proofing mindset with you and also to be emboldened that your work is not just a kind of niche technological work. It's not just about financial services or creating efficient ways of adding value to others. It's also, there's a great and much deeper and broader social function to what you're doing. And I think there's beautiful emergent order in this room. A lot of people separately pursuing their own objectives, but through that we can actually create beautiful, complex, and world-changing systems. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing. And I couldn't help but notice this, the Times of London newspaper. So that, I assume, was published on the day that Bitcoin was. That's correct. On the January the 3rd, that was the headline article that Satoshi alluded to in his Hex submission. Chancellor on the brink of a second bailout. Yeah. So I just want to alert you to the price of that newspaper. It was £1.50 on that Saturday. So a weekend times of London is more expensive than a normal one. But I looked it up, and today it's worth £4. And that's not very much time has passed since then, a mere 16 years. So I think that also shows you the scale of the problems that we're dealing with and how insidious something like inflation is. And when we talk about inflation, it's not just an abstract economic concept. It has real detrimental effects on people's lives. So so I think Bitcoin is onto something, and I just wanted to thank you very much for the time today, and wanted to encourage you to think about how you can instill this idea of state-proofing in your own life, and how you can take that message forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Wonderful.